On October the 21st, 2010, a small team of researchers in Leipzig, Germany finished a task that should have been impossible. They had just sequenced a complete genome from a single pinky bone fragment, no bigger than a fingertip, found 2 years earlier in a freezing cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. The bone belonged to a girl who had died roughly 50,000 years earlier. When the results came back, the scientists realized the DNA did not match any known human population. It did not match Neanderthals. It did not match anyone alive today. They had just found evidence of an entirely new branch of the human family, a species science did not know existed. They called them the Denisovans. That discovery would have been shocking enough on its own, but it was only the first thread in a genetic mystery that, within a decade, would completely rewrite the accepted timeline of human evolution and expose one living population on Earth whose DNA still does not fit any model scientists have built. Right now, fewer than a couple hundred members of that population are known to still be alive. Their language has never been recorded. Their genome has never been fully sequenced. And every year that passes without answers is a year closer to those answers disappearing forever, taking with them the last surviving proof of human species we have never identified and may never find again. To understand why this matters, we need to go back further, to the year 2009, when a team of geneticists at Stanford University attempted something nobody had tried before on this scale. They collected DNA samples from 938 individuals across 51 populations, spanning every inhabited continent, Africa, Europe, the Americas, East Asia, and the Pacific Islands. They wanted to build a family tree of the entire human species, using nothing but genetic code. When they ran the analysis, most of the results lined up exactly as predicted. Europeans clustered with Europeans. East Asians clustered with East Asians. African populations showed the deepest, oldest genetic branches, consistent with the idea that modern humans first evolved there. Nearly every population on the planet fit neatly onto a single branching tree of migration out of Africa. Nearly every population. One group refused to fit anywhere on that tree, and their DNA contained something that, at the time, nobody could explain. The foundation of the story starts in East Africa, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. That is roughly when anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, first appear in the fossil record. For most of the following 150,000 years, our species stayed almost entirely within Africa, slowly forming distinct regional lineages. Some of the oldest and most genetically diverse populations alive today, including groups in southern and central Africa, descend directly from that early period, and geneticists still use their genomes as a reference point for the root of the human family tree. Then, somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 years ago, a small group left. Estimates suggest it may have been only a few thousand people who crossed out of the Horn of Africa, likely near the southern end of the Red Sea, into the Arabian Peninsula. That single migration, or a handful of closely spaced ones, is believed to be the ancestral source of nearly every non-African population alive today. But when that small group of humans moved into Europe and Asia, they discovered the continents were not empty. Other hominins were already there. In Europe and parts of Western Asia, they encountered the Neanderthals, a species that had already been established for hundreds of thousands of years, built for cold climates, physically powerful, and, we now know, intelligent enough to make tools, control fire, and possibly create symbolic art. The two groups did not simply pass each other in the landscape, they interbred. Today, most people of European and Asian descent carry somewhere between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA, a genetic fingerprint of encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. Populations whose ancestors stayed in Africa during this period carry almost none. For decades, the discovery of Neanderthal DNA in modern genomes was considered the single biggest revision to the human story. Neanderthals were once portrayed as brutish evolutionary dead ends, but the genetic evidence, combined with archaeological finds of deliberate burials, pigment use, and personal ornaments, forced scientists to reconsider them as cognitively sophisticated relatives rather than a failed branch of evolution. The interbreeding itself appears to have happened in multiple pulses, at different points and in different regions, as modern humans repeatedly encountered Neanderthal groups while expanding across Europe and Western Asia over thousands of years. Neanderthals, however, were not the only other humans still walking the earth. Farther east in the Altai Mountains, the same 2010 discovery revealed the Denisovans, a species known almost entirely through fragments, a finger bone, a handful of teeth, and a fragment of skull, plus a jawbone found in Tibet years later, in 2019. Despite this almost non-existent fossil record, scientists managed to extract a complete genome from those fragments. When they compared it to living populations, they expected to find the strongest traces in East Asia, close to where the bones were unearthed. They did find some there, roughly 2% in Han Chinese populations, slightly higher in some Tibetan groups, But the highest concentration of Denisovan DNA on the entire planet was not anywhere near Siberia. It turned up thousands of miles to the south in Papua New Guinea, Australia, and across the islands of Melanesia, where modern populations carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan ancestry, more than 20 times the amount found anywhere else. That was the first hint that the accepted map of ancient human movement was incomplete. The real anomaly, though, the population that genuinely broke the model, was found somewhere else entirely, on a small, remote chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal. The Andaman Islands sit roughly halfway between India and Myanmar, a scattering of more than 500 mostly uninhabited islands covered in dense tropical rainforest. For tens of thousands of years, the people living there had essentially no sustained contact with the outside world. No major trade routes passed through. No empires conquered them. Their way of life stayed almost completely unchanged. Small bands of hunter-gatherers using bows and arrows to hunt wild pigs, and fishing nets to work the shallow coastal waters. Early sailors who passed near the islands, including some Arab and Chinese traders centuries earlier, described the region with a mixture of fascination and fear, spreading stories about a hostile, unapproachable population defending an isolated stretch of coastline. When European ships began reaching the islands in greater numbers in the late 1700s, sailors described the inhabitants in terms that confused them. The islanders were short, often under 5 feet tall, with very dark skin and tightly curled hair, physical traits that reminded European observers of populations in Africa, despite being separated from that continent by thousands of miles and surrounded on the mainland by South Asian populations who looked completely different. For 2 centuries, anthropologists debated who these people actually were. Some proposed they were descendants of shipwrecked African slaves. Others argued they were a surviving relic of an ancient migration that had otherwise vanished everywhere else on Earth. Without genetic evidence, none of it could be settled. That changed in the early 2000s, when researchers finally sequenced DNA from members of the Andamanese tribes. What they found overturned both theories. The Andamanese were not of recent African descent. They were not closely related to mainland Indian populations either. In fact, they turned out to be one of the most genetically isolated peoples ever documented anywhere on the planet, with DNA unlike almost any other population studied. The initial analysis showed their lineage split off from the rest of humanity, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago, placing them squarely within that first wave of migration out of Africa, the same wave that eventually populated the rest of the non-African world. But everywhere else that first wave settled, later migrations overwrote much of the original genetic signal. Farming populations expanding out of the Middle East, pastoralist groups sweeping in from the steppes of Central Asia, large-scale expansions of Han Chinese and Bantu-speaking populations, each of these later waves layered new DNA on top of the old, blending and diluting the traces of those first travelers almost everywhere. Almost everywhere, except the Andaman Islands. There, isolated by open ocean and left almost entirely alone, the genetic signature of that first migration survived intact for tens of thousands of years. The Andamanese are, in a very real sense, a living window into what those first non-African humans may have looked like genetically. That discovery alone would have justified endless scientific attention. But it was not the strangest thing hidden in their genome. When researchers dug deeper into Andamanese DNA, they found sequences that did not belong to modern humans, and did not match Neanderthals either. They matched Denisovans, the same archaic species whose remains had been pulled from a cave more than 3,000 miles to the north in Siberia. And the amount was not trivial. The Andamanese carried more Denisovan ancestry than mainland Asians, more than Europeans, and comparable in some measurements to the populations of New Guinea. Under the existing model, this made no sense. Denisovans were believed to have lived primarily in Siberia and possibly parts of East Asia, with their DNA supposedly entering the human gene pool there before spreading southeast with later migrations into the Pacific. But the Andamanese had been isolated on their islands for roughly 50,000 years, with essentially no genetic exchange with anyone outside their own communities. So how did Denisovan ancestry end up inside them? There was only one explanation that fit all the evidence. Denisovans must have ranged much farther south than anyone had assumed, likely across large parts of Southeast Asia, including the regions that are now Indonesia, the Philippines, and the surrounding islands. When the first wave of modern humans moved east along the southern coast of Asia, they would have encountered Denisovan populations there directly, not in Siberia, but in the tropics. Interbreeding happened in that region, and the resulting mixed populations then spread outward, some ending up isolated on the Andaman Islands, others continuing farther east toward New Guinea and Australia. This single finding forced a complete rewrite of Denisovan geography. Rather than a small, cold, adapted population confined to a narrow strip of northern Asia, Denisovans appear to have occupied an enormous range, stretching from the frozen mountains of Siberia down through thousands of miles of terrain to the humid equatorial islands of Southeast Asia. That range, once mapped out, exceeds the modern geographic range of any single living great ape species, and it was inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years by a species we know almost nothing about physically. The entire fossil record for that species, spread across a landmass larger than most countries, consists of a finger bone, a handful of teeth, a skull fragment, and one jawbone. Everything else we know comes from DNA, the genetic residue left behind in the populations that absorbed them before they disappeared. In 2019, a team of researchers led by Guy Jacobs published a study in the journal Cell that made the picture even more complicated. Analyzing Denisovan ancestry and Papuan populations in detail, they found the signal did not come from a single source. There were at least 2, and possibly 3, genetically distinct Denisovan populations that had separately contributed ancestry to modern humans, populations that had themselves split apart from one another at least 280,000 years earlier. They were different enough that researchers began referring to them by separate designations. The classical Denisovans represented by the Siberian cave specimens, and at least one additional, more divergent southern lineage that contributed heavily to Andamanese, Papuan, and Aboriginal Australian ancestry. In other words, the human family tree was never really a tree at all. It behaves more like a tangled network, a mesh of different hominin populations, meeting, mixing, separating, and meeting again across hundreds of thousands of years. The Andamanese sit near the center of one of the densest tangles found anywhere on Earth, carrying genetic material from at least 2 extinct human lineages that no longer exist anywhere on the planet in unmixed form. Even that was not the full picture. When geneticists examined the deepest, oldest layers of Andamanese DNA, portions that did not match modern humans, did not match Neanderthals, and did not match either known Denisovan lineage, they found short fragments that matched nothing in any database. Not a known modern population, not any identified archaic human, nothing. Researchers began calling these fragments ghost lineages, genetic material left behind by a hominin population that has never been physically identified, whose bones have never been recovered, but whose DNA is still present inside living people today. The Andamanese carry traces from at least one such unidentified population, evidence of interbreeding that likely occurred tens of thousands of years ago with a group of humans, who then vanished so completely that no fossil, no tool, no trace of their physical existence has ever been found. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know exactly where they lived. We do not know technically what species they belonged to. The only reason we know they existed at all is that fragments of their DNA are still circulating inside the cells of a few hundred people on a small chain of islands in the Bay of Bengal. This is not an isolated case either. Separate genetic studies have identified similar ghost lineages contributing to modern populations in West Africa, and Central African hunter-gatherer populations, often referred to broadly as pygmy populations, appear to carry traces of yet another distinct unidentified lineage. Researchers working on these African signals have estimated that the interbreeding events behind them may have occurred within the last 30,000 to 50,000 years, meaning some unidentified archaic populations may have survived on the African continent far longer than anyone previously assumed, potentially overlapping in time with early agricultural societies. These ghost signals are scattered throughout the human genome like fingerprints left at a scene where the person who left them can never be named. But the Andamanese case remains one of the clearest and most concentrated examples researchers have found, precisely because their isolation prevented later migrations from diluting or erasing the signal, the way it was erased almost everywhere else on Earth. Taken together, the classical Denisovans of Siberia, the deeply divergent southern Denisovan lineage, and at least one unnamed ghost population combine inside Andamanese DNA to create a genetic profile unlike anything else measured on the planet. No other studied population carries this particular combination of ancestries in these proportions, which is precisely why geneticists keep returning to these islands whenever they want to test the limits of what the human family tree can actually explain. What all of this means is that the Andamanese are not simply an isolated ethnic group. Genetically, they are a fusion of multiple human lineages, at least 2 of them extinct, and possibly a third that science has not yet identified or named. Every person from these communities carries, inside their own cells, a working genetic archive of populations that no longer exist anywhere else in unmixed form, and that archive is disappearing. When the British established a colonial presence on the Andaman Islands in the 1850s, the combined indigenous population across the various tribes was estimated at somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 people, spread across groups including the Great Andamanese, the Onge, the Jarawa, and the Sentinelese. Within 50 years, sustained contact with outsiders introduced diseases the islanders had no prior immunity to, including measles, influenza, and syphilis. The Great Andamanese population, once numbering in the thousands, collapsed to a few dozen individuals within a few generations. Today, the Great Andamanese number roughly 50 people. The Onge are estimated at around 100. The Jarawa, who did not make consistent peaceful contact with the outside world until 1998, number somewhere around 400. And the Sentinelese, who live in complete isolation on North Sentinel Island and have violently rejected all outside contact for generations, are believed to number somewhere between 50 and 200 people, though no census has ever been possible, because anyone who approaches the island's shoreline is met with arrows. This means the only living people on Earth who carry this specific, extraordinarily rare combination of ancient human ancestry, including ghost lineages that exist nowhere else in identifiable form, could be reduced to nothing within a single generation. One serious disease outbreak, one natural disaster, one poorly considered policy decision, and more than 50,000 years of continuous genetic heritage, a living record of multiple extinct human populations, would be gone permanently with no way to recover it. The Indian government, which has jurisdiction over the islands, has taken this risk seriously. The Andaman Islands are designated as a protected area, and North Sentinel Island in particular is legally off limits to outsiders under any circumstances, a policy backed by both law and, quite literally, armed enforcement from the islanders themselves. In November 2018, an American named John Allen Chow attempted to reach North Sentinel Island illegally, apparently intending religious missionary contact. He hired local fishermen to bring him close to shore and paddled a kayak the rest of the way. According to accounts pieced together afterward, he was killed by Sentinelese islanders within hours of landing, and his body could not be recovered because retrieval attempts risked further, potentially lethal confrontation, as well as disease exposure for the tribe. Indian authorities ultimately chose not to pursue prosecution against the islanders, stating publicly that the tribe was acting to protect itself, and that any attempt at retaliation or forced retrieval would put the remaining Sentinelese at significantly greater risk from outside disease and disruption than the incident itself had caused. The Chow case was not an isolated incident either. Throughout the 20th century, there were repeated attempts, some by anthropologists, some by curious travelers, and some by Indian naval patrols, to establish peaceful contact with the Sentinelese. A handful of expeditions in the 1990s managed brief, cautious exchanges of coconuts and other gifts left on the beach, but even those limited efforts were eventually abandoned after occasional violent confrontations and growing concern among health officials that any repeated contact risked introducing disease into a population with no immunity whatsoever, a concern rooted directly in what had already happened to the other Andamanese tribes a century earlier. So the Sentinelese remain exactly where they have always been, isolated, self-sufficient, and completely outside modern civilization. They hunt using bows and arrows. They build small dugout canoes for fishing in shallow coastal waters. They speak a language that has never been recorded, translated, or classified by outside linguists. And inside their cells, every single one of them carries genetic material inherited from human populations that disappeared from the rest of the world long before agriculture, writing, or organized religion existed anywhere on the planet. Satellite imagery of North Sentinel Island shows small clearings in the dense jungle canopy, thin lines of smoke rising from cooking fires, and occasionally small human figures visible near the beach, sometimes carrying spears, apparently watching the horizon for approaching boats. After the devastating Indian Ocean tsunami of December 2004, which killed close to 250,000 people across the region, officials sent a helicopter to check whether the Sentinelese had survived. As the helicopter passed low over the island, a Sentinelese man emerged from the tree line and fired an arrow toward it. That single act, hostile as it was, served as the confirmation authorities needed. The tribe had survived. No further contact was attempted. No medical aid was offered. No relief supplies were dropped. Indian authorities concluded, based on decades of prior experience with other Andamanese groups, that the safest course of action for the tribe's survival was to leave them completely alone, even in the immediate aftermath of a regional catastrophe. The broader scientific implications of the Andamanese genome are still being worked out today. Researchers have begun searching other extremely isolated human populations for similar patterns, small highland communities in New Guinea, remote groups in the Amazon basin, and hunter-gatherer populations in Central Africa. In several of these groups, scientists have already identified comparable signals: DNA fragments that do not correspond to any known modern or archaic population, additional ghost lineages, echoes of extinct human relatives whose stories were lost entirely once their remains decomposed and their communities disappeared. What all of this suggests is that the version of human evolution most people learned in school, a relatively simple progression from an African origin outward, is fundamentally incomplete. Modern humans were never the only intelligent hominins on the planet for most of our species' history. Neanderthals occupied Europe. Denisovans, in at least 2 or 3 distinct forms, occupied a vast stretch of Asia, extending into the tropics. And other populations, not yet identified by name, existed in regions we have not fully mapped genetically. These groups lived alongside early modern humans. They competed with them for resources. They occasionally interbred with them. And, one by one, over tens of thousands of years, Every one of them disappeared, leaving behind nothing but fragments of DNA inside the descendants of the people they mixed with. The Andamanese represent the most concentrated surviving example of that ancient mixing found anywhere on Earth. They are not a primitive population, and they are not a genetically pure or unchanged one either. They are, more accurately, a living archive containing genetic evidence of encounters between different human species that took place tens of thousands of years before any city was built anywhere in the world. And that archive is fragile in a way that few people outside genetics fully appreciate. Traditional Andamanese languages are actively dying out. Cultural knowledge specific to these communities is fading with each passing generation. The populations themselves remain small enough that a single serious health crisis could effectively end them within years, not centuries. In 2020, a group of population geneticists published a paper in the journal Nature that included a notable recommendation buried in its discussion section. They argued that the full genomes of small, isolated populations like the Andamanese should be sequenced comprehensively and preserved in international genetic databases, not for commercial application, but purely as a record of human prehistory that would otherwise be lost. Their reasoning was that these genomes constitute a form of shared human heritage, and that losing them permanently would be comparable to losing an irreplaceable historical archive. Except this archive is written in DNA rather than parchment, and it stretches back hundreds of thousands of years rather than a few centuries. That preservation work is now happening gradually, and always with the informed consent of the communities involved. The great Andamanese have permitted researchers to collect samples for long-term genetic study. The Ong have taken part in comparable research efforts. The Jarawa, given their more limited and cautious contact with outsiders, have allowed some restricted participation. The Sentinelese, by contrast, remain completely untouched and unstudied, and given the current legal protections and the tribe's own defensive stance, their genome may remain a permanent, unsolvable mystery. If you have ever looked at a consumer DNA test and noticed a small, unexplained percentage labeled simply as ancient or unassigned ancestry, this is a meaningful part of the reason why. Geneticists are still actively discovering who our ancestors actually mixed with, and the picture keeps changing as more isolated populations are studied. The human family tree, as it turns out, is not really a tree at all. It behaves much more like a forest, dense, tangled, and only partially mapped. The Andamanese represent one of the very few places left on Earth where a significant portion of that entire forest can still be observed in one place, preserved inside the living cells of a few hundred people, scattered across a remote chain of islands at the edge of the Indian Ocean. They stand as direct proof that the standard model of human origins taught in most classrooms remains incomplete in fundamental ways. And with every year that passes, with disease risk, population decline, and cultural erosion all working against them, the window to study, understand, and preserve what their DNA can still tell us about our shared, tangled, unfinished human story continues to narrow.